It was the kind of morning that made Buckingham Palace look like it had been painted rather than built. The light hit the stone in long, golden strips, and the flags above the east wing moved just enough to seem alive. Everything about the place was designed to make ordinary people feel small, and, on most days, it worked. But, this particular Tuesday in the late autumn of 2023 carried something in its air that even the most seasoned courtiers could feel: a low, electric hum of tension that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with what was sitting inside a locked room on the second floor. The Vladimir Tiara. It had been on loan from the Royal Collection Trust for a planned exhibition, a modest, carefully curated show celebrating the jewels of the late Queen Elizabeth II, the pieces she had worn at coronations, state dinners, funerals, and the quiet moments in between that no camera had ever captured. The tiara itself was extraordinary. Made in Russia in the early 20th century, it had passed through the hands of Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna before finding its way into the British royal family through Queen Mary, who had purchased it in 1921. Queen Elizabeth had loved it deeply, worn it often, and adapted it over the decades with interchangeable pearl and emerald drops that gave it a versatility rare among pieces of its age and weight. It was not simply jewelry. It was history shaped into metal and stone. The exhibition had been planned for months. The curatorial team had spent the better part of a year working with representatives from Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, and Clarence House to arrange the loans, the security protocols, the display cases, the lighting, the catalogue essays, and the insurance valuations. Everything had been approved. Everything had been documented. There were forms in triplicate and digital records backed up on 3 separate servers. And then, on this particular Tuesday morning, Camilla, the Queen Consort, arrived at the palace with a request that nobody had seen coming. She wanted to wear the Vladimir tiara to an upcoming state dinner. The request itself was not outrageous. Camilla had worn pieces from the royal collection before. She had worn the Greville tiara, the Boucheron tiara, and several of the late Queen's brooches at significant events. She was, by this point, the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, and the royal collection existed, in no small part, to be used by the royal family at official functions. The argument for lending her the tiara was not an unreasonable one. But, the Vladimir tiara had already been formally transferred to the custody of the exhibition team. It had been logged, catalogued, and placed under strict security protocols that required a specific chain of authorization before it could be moved, touched, or removed from its case. Those protocols were not suggestions. They were legal obligations, tied to the loan agreement, the insurance policy, and the liability framework that governed the entire exhibition. To remove the tiara now, without going through the proper channels, would require unwinding a considerable amount of very carefully structured paperwork. Nobody had told Camilla this before she arrived. Or perhaps someone had, and the message had not fully registered. These things happened in palaces more often than anyone admitted. Communication moved through so many layers of private secretaries, equerries, ladies-in-waiting, and protocol officers that by the time a piece of information reached the person it was meant for, it had sometimes been softened into meaninglessness. Whatever the reason, Camilla arrived that morning with the expectation that the tiara would be made available to her, and she found, instead, a guard stationed outside the room where it was kept, and that guard had very specific instructions about who was and was not permitted to enter. His name was Sergeant David Hartley, and he had been in royal protection for 11 years. He was not a man given to drama. He did not enjoy confrontation. He had spent more than a decade in a profession that required enormous discretion, an almost preternatural calm, and the ability to enforce rules without making the people subject to those rules feel insulted. He was very good at his job. But, standing in the corridor that morning, watching the Queen Consort approach with her private secretary at her side and the unmistakable expression of someone who had already decided how this interaction was going to go, Sergeant Hartley felt the very specific anxiety of a man who knows that no version of the next few minutes is going to be entirely comfortable. He held his position. That was the first thing. He did not step aside, did not move, did not soften his posture. His instructions were clear, and his instructions came from the head of security for the exhibition, who had received them from the insurers, who had received them from the legal team. The chain was unambiguous. No one was to have access to the secured items without prior authorization processed through the proper channels.
That meant paperwork. That meant time.
That meant this was not something that could be resolved by the queen consort simply walking through a door. He said, very politely, that he was unable to permit entry without the appropriate clearance. Camilla stopped. The corridor was very quiet. These old palace hallways had a way of absorbing sound, the thick carpets, the heavy curtains, the sheer mass of the walls, so that even a conversation that might have felt heated somewhere else seemed muffled and contained here, as though the building itself were trying to keep things dignified. Her private secretary exchanged a look with the equerry who had accompanied them. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then, Camilla said, pleasantly enough, that she was the queen consort, and that she had come to view an item from the royal collection. Sergeant Hartley said, equally pleasantly, that he understood, and that he was very sorry, but his instructions did not permit him to allow access without the appropriate documentation having been processed first. It was, by any objective measure, a remarkable moment. Not because it was explosive, it was not. There was no shouting, no scene, no moment of visible fury. What made it remarkable was precisely its quietness, and the very specific kind of tension that quietness contained. Sergeant Hartley was following the rules. The rules were legitimate. They existed to protect something genuinely irreplaceable. And he was enforcing them against a woman who was, constitutionally and, practically speaking, one of the most senior members of the British royal family. Most people in his position would have found a way to bend. Would have decided that this was above their pay grade, that someone else could sort out the paperwork problem, that the path of least resistance was to step aside and let the chips fall where they may. The pressure to simply defer, to treat the title as its own authorization, was enormous and largely invisible, the kind of pressure that does not announce itself but simply settles over a situation like weather, shaping the way everyone involved thinks about what is possible and what is not. Sergeant Hartley did not bend. He stood there, polite and immovable, and said again that he was unable to permit entry without clearance, and that he would be very happy to assist in expediting the authorization process if that would be helpful. The private secretary stepped forward and began explaining, in the careful language of someone who has experience navigating institutional friction, that the queen consort had a prior understanding with the curator's office, that there had been some miscommunication, that the matter could certainly be resolved quickly. Sergeant Hartley listened with genuine respect. He said that he had no doubt that was true, and that as soon as the clearance had been processed through the proper channels, he would be delighted to facilitate access. Until then, he was afraid his hands were tied. The word afraid was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. He was not afraid. He was certain. But the word softened the refusal without changing it, and that was a skill in itself. Word traveled fast in a palace, and, within 20 minutes the situation had reached a level of the household that had not been anticipated when the morning began. The curator of the exhibition had been called. The head of the Royal Collection Trust had been informed. 3 different private secretaries were now involved in trying to work out exactly how the misunderstanding had occurred, who bore responsibility for the communication failure, and how quickly the authorization could be properly processed. And, then, someone had the good sense to call Princess Anne. It was not the most obvious call to make. Princess Anne was not the keeper of the privy purse. She was not the head of the Royal Collection Trust. She had no formal administrative role in the management of the exhibition. But she was, in the estimation of nearly everyone who worked inside the palace, the person you called when something needed sorting. Not because she had the authority on paper, though she often did, but because she had the authority in practice, which was a different and more useful thing entirely. Princess Anne had spent more than 50 years in royal service. She had attended more engagements than any other member of the royal family. She had run more committees, chaired more boards, cut through more bureaucratic tangles, and endured more logistical absurdity than anyone else in the building. She had a reputation for impatience with nonsense and an equally strong reputation for getting things done correctly, which was not the same as getting them done quickly. She believed, with a sincerity that was entirely unperformative, that the rules mattered. That institutions functioned because people respected their structures. That bending rules for convenience was how institutions began to rot from the inside. She also knew the Vladimir Tiara. She had known it her whole life. She had watched her mother wear it at state dinners, had stood beside her at receptions where the pearl drops caught the light and turned it into something almost living. She understood, in a way that went beyond the curatorial or the legal, exactly what was at stake. She arrived in the corridor 12 minutes after being called. She was wearing country clothes. She had apparently been in the middle of something entirely different before the call reached her, and she looked, as she often did, like someone who had been interrupted and did not intend to stay long. She took in the scene with the quick, comprehensive glance of someone practiced at reading rooms, said a brief word to Camilla that nobody within earshot fully caught, and then turned to Sergeant Hartley. She asked him, directly, to walk her through exactly what authorization was required and where in the process the blockage was occurring. He told her. Clearly, specifically, without hedging. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once, said something to the private secretary that caused that person to immediately reach for their phone, and then turned back to Camilla with an expression that was not unkind but was entirely without softness. She said, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has already decided what is going to happen, that they would get this sorted through the proper channels, that it would take the time it took, and that the guard was absolutely right to have done exactly what he had done. The corridor was quiet again for a moment. It was, by every external measure, a small thing. A bureaucratic tangle. A miscommunication about access protocols. The kind of friction that large institutions generate constantly and resolve constantly, usually without anyone outside the building ever knowing it occurred. But the people standing in that corridor understood that it was also something else entirely. It was a test of whether the rules applied equally, and whether the person responsible for enforcing them would hold their ground when it mattered. Sergeant Hartley had held his ground. And Princess N, who had arrived expecting to find a mess, found instead that the mess had already been handled by someone doing their job properly. She had come to resolve a situation, and discovered that the situation had, in the most important sense, already been resolved. What remained was paperwork. What remained was process. What remained was the ordinary machinery of institutions working the way they were supposed to work, which was not glamorous and not interesting and was, in Princess N's long experience, the entire point. The authorization process was formally initiated that morning. It would take 2 days to complete. The Vladimir Tiara stayed in its case, in its secured room, under Sergeant Hartley's watch. The state dinner was still weeks away. There was time. There had always been time. That was the thing nobody had wanted to say at the beginning of the morning, and the thing that was now entirely obvious. What had looked, from the outside, like a confrontation had been, from the inside, something considerably more interesting, a moment where the ordinary weight of institutional rules had pressed up against the extraordinary weight of royal expectation, and the rules had held. Not because anyone had been rude. Not because anyone had been unreasonable. But because one man had stood in a corridor and done his job, and that had turned out to be enough. The morning moved on. The palace absorbed the incident the way it absorbed everything, quietly, completely, without visible trace. By noon, the story was already becoming the kind of thing that gets told in hushed voices over coffee in the lower offices, each retelling shaving away a little more of the complexity and adding a little more of the drama, until eventually what had been a careful, almost gentle confrontation between protocol and precedent became, in the telling, something much simpler. A guard had blocked the queen consort. A princess had stepped in. A tiara had stayed safe. All of that was true. None of it was the whole story. The whole story was in the corridor, in the quiet, in the moment when a man doing his job had looked at one of the most powerful women in Britain and said, with every courtesy at his disposal, that the rules were the rules, and that they applied to everyone, and that he was very sorry, but he could not move. That moment would not make the news. It would not appear in any official record. The exhibition would open on schedule, the Vladimir Tiara would be displayed in its case with the pearl drops catching the light exactly as the curators had planned, and Sergeant David Hartley would go home at the end of his shift and say nothing about it to anyone, because that was the job, and he understood the job, and he was very good at it. But the people in that corridor knew what had happened. And, in the particular world of the British royal household, where so much depended on the quiet maintenance of things that never appeared on any agenda, that knowledge was its own kind of record. The morning's tension had passed.
The process had begun.
And, somewhere in a locked room on the second floor of Buckingham Palace, the Vladimir tiara sat in its case, the pearl drop still, the gold still, the history of it undisturbed, waiting, as it had always waited, for the right moment and the right hands and the right ceremony of authorization to bring it back into the light. The 2 days that followed were not quiet days. Inside the palace, the machinery of authorization ground forward with the particular combination of speed and formality that distinguished royal institutions from ordinary bureaucracies, the speed coming from the fact that people with significant power were paying attention, and the formality coming from the fact that those same people understood, at a level that was almost instinctive, that the speed could not be allowed to compromise the form. The form was the point. The form was what made the whole thing legitimate.
3 separate teams were now involved in processing the clearance request.
The first was the legal team attached to the Royal Collection Trust, who had to formally verify that the terms of the original loan agreement permitted the kind of secondary access that Camilla's request would require. The second was the insurance team, who had to assess whether allowing the tiara to be removed from its secured display context, even temporarily, even within the palace, would affect the liability coverage in ways that required renegotiation. And the third was the curatorial team itself, whose concerns were not primarily legal but were no less serious. They had spent months planning the exhibition around the Vladimir tiara as a centerpiece, and any interruption to its availability, even a brief one, had to be managed carefully to avoid disrupting the installation timeline. All 3 teams were working simultaneously, with varying degrees of urgency and varying degrees of success. The legal review moved fastest. The loan agreement, it turned out, contained a provision that the original drafters had included almost as an afterthought, a clause specifying that items on loan to the exhibition could be accessed by members of the royal family for official purposes, provided that such access was authorized through the appropriate palace channels and did not require the physical removal of the item from the secured facility. The clause was narrow. It did not permit Camilla to take the tiara away. It did permit her to view it, in its case, in the secured room, under conditions that maintained the integrity of the security protocols. The legal team forwarded their analysis to the insurance team with a note indicating that the access, if conducted under these specific conditions, fell within the parameters of the existing coverage. The insurance team read the legal analysis, consulted their own records, and replied the following morning with a 3-page document confirming that they agreed with the legal team's interpretation, provided that the specific conditions outlined in the clause were met, and provided further that access was formally logged and that the exhibition's own security team was present during any such visit.
They attached a form. The form required signatures from 4 different parties.
Meanwhile, in a quiet office on the other side of the palace, the question of how the misunderstanding had occurred in the first place was being examined with the kind of careful, collective attention that institutions bring to problems they need to understand before they can prevent them from happening again. The answer, when it emerged, was both simple and entirely typical of the way information moved through large, layered organizations. Camilla's private secretary had communicated the request for tiara access to a liaison at the Royal Collection Trust, who had passed it to a member of the curatorial team, who had flagged it as an issue requiring authorization and sent that flag to the head of exhibitions, but the head of exhibitions had been traveling that week, and the flag had sat in an inbox, acknowledged but not actioned, for 5 days. By the time the head of exhibitions returned and saw the flag, Camilla's team had already made alternative arrangements for the morning of her visit, operating under the assumption that the silence meant approval. It did not mean approval. It meant the inbox had been unread. 5 days and an unread inbox. That was the whole story, at the administrative level. It was the kind of thing that happened constantly in organizations of any size, and the fact that it had happened in Buckingham Palace, involving a piece of jewelry worth several £1,000,000 and a member of the royal family, did not make it less ordinary. It made it considerably more visible, which was not the same thing. The head of exhibitions, upon returning, had sent an immediate apology and initiated the proper authorization process, but by then, it was too late to prevent the morning's corridor incident, because Camilla had already arrived. The corrective action had run 1 day behind the event it was meant to prevent. These things happened. The important thing, as various people kept saying to each other in the days that followed, was that the system had worked. The guard had done his job. The protocols had held. The error had been an administrative one, not a security one, and no harm had come to the tiara, to the exhibition, or to anyone involved. The appropriate lessons would be learned, the appropriate adjustments would be made, and everyone would move on. But moving on, in this particular world, was not quite as simple as it sounded. The story had escaped the corridor. Not to the press, not yet, and, ideally, not ever. The people involved understood very clearly that the last thing any of them needed was a tabloid headline about a confrontation between the queen consort and a palace guard over a diamond tiara.
Even a sympathetic headline would be damaging.
The optics of royal jewelry disputes were essentially inescapable, whatever the reality, whatever the nuance, whatever the entirely reasonable explanation. The story would be reduced to its most dramatic possible form and repeated until it became the only version anyone remembered. But, within the palace, the story had moved the way stories always moved inside closed institutions, along the invisible channels of professional conversation, shared meals, chance encounters in corridors, and the quiet, constant exchange of information that constituted the social life of any large household. By the end of the first day, most of the people who worked in the building knew that something had happened. By the end of the second day, most of them knew most of the details. By the end of the week, the incident had been absorbed into the particular mythology of palace working life, the collection of stories that circulated privately among people who understood the difference between what appeared in the newspapers and what actually occurred. Sergeant Hartley had become, in this mythology, something of a figure of quiet legend. Not because what he had done was extraordinary, it was not, by any technical measure. He had done exactly what he was supposed to do. But, the doing of exactly what you were supposed to do, in a situation where almost every social and institutional force was pushing you to do something else, was the kind of thing that people noticed and remembered. It was the kind of thing that said something about a person, and what it said was not complicated. He was someone you could rely on. His colleagues treated him with the particular mix of respect and gentle humor that professional communities reserve for people who have done something everyone agrees was right, and nobody is entirely surprised to learn they were the one to do it.
There was no formal acknowledgement.
There would never be a formal acknowledgement. That was not how these things worked. But the informal acknowledgement was real and warm, and, in the world Hartley moved through every day, it was the kind that mattered. Princess N, for her part, had said nothing further about the incident after that morning in the corridor. She had returned to whatever she had been doing before she was called, and the palace had simply continued around her, as it always did. But she had made one additional move, quietly, through the appropriate channels, that would have consequences for how this kind of situation was handled in the future. She had requested a formal review of the communication protocols between the palace household offices and the Royal Collection Trust, specifically as they apply to requests involving items currently on loan for external or internal exhibitions. She had framed the request in the driest possible institutional language, the kind that said nothing about what had actually happened while making absolutely clear that something had needed to say something about. The review would be conducted over the following months by a small committee of relevant officials, and its findings would result in a revised set of guidelines that nobody outside a very small group of people would ever read or know about, but which would prevent the same kind of inbox-lag mistake from creating the same kind of corridor confrontation in the future. It was exactly the kind of intervention Princess N specialized in, not dramatic, not visible, not designed to assign blame or generate consequences, but structural. She fixed the thing that had broken rather than simply addressing the symptom. This was, in the estimation of the people who worked most closely with her, her most underappreciated quality. She was not interested in the story of what had gone wrong. She was interested in making sure it didn't go wrong again. Camilla, meanwhile, navigated the aftermath with the composure that years of royal life had made second nature to her. She had been in difficult situations before, situations far more difficult and far more public than a corridor conversation with a guard. She understood, at a level that required no conscious effort, that the right response to institutional friction was neither force nor retreat but simple, dignified patience.
She waited. The authorization was processed. The forms were completed and signed by the appropriate parties.
And, on the third day after the original incident, with all 4 signatures in place and the exhibition security team notified and present, she was escorted into the secured room and stood before the Vladimir tiara in its case, in the light that the curators had arranged for it.
It was extraordinary.
She had seen photographs, of course, and had seen the tiara on various occasions when it had been worn at official events. But seeing it here, still, in a case, in controlled light, with no ceremony or occasion or surrounding bustle to compete for attention, that was different. The craftsmanship was more visible. The history was more legible. The 3 rows of gold graduated arches, each set with diamonds, and the pearl drops hanging from them in the arrangement that Queen Mary had favored, all of it was there, completely, in a way it never quite was when it was being worn. She stood looking at it for several minutes. The security officer who was present later described her as simply quiet, not emotional, not performative, just quiet, in the way of someone who is paying genuine attention to something that deserves it. She asked, eventually, about the history of the pearl drops, whether they were the original Russian pearls or the replacements that Queen Mary had commissioned, and what the process of switching between the pearl and emerald configurations actually involved from a conservation standpoint. The curator who was present answered at length, and Camilla listened with what appeared to be genuine interest. The conversation lasted the better part of half an hour and covered subjects ranging from 19th-century Russian metalworking techniques to the specific challenges of storing pearl jewelry in controlled environments. It was, by the end of it, a considerably more educational visit than anyone had anticipated. She thanked the team when she left. She thanked Sergeant Hartley, who was again at his post outside the door. She said something to him, again, nothing that the people nearby quite caught, and he replied, and there was what several witnesses later described as a brief, genuine exchange, the kind that happens between people who have been on opposite sides of something and have both come through it without losing their dignity. The state dinner was 3 weeks away. The question of whether the Vladimir tiara would be lent to Camilla for the event was now formally under discussion through the proper channels, with all the relevant parties involved and all the relevant documentation being prepared. It was a complicated question not because of any remaining animosity or institutional friction, but because the logistics of temporarily removing a piece from an active exhibition, even for a single evening, involved a considerable amount of coordination between the security team, the insurance company, the conservation team, and the exhibition curators. Nothing about it was simple, and the timeline was tight. But it was being worked on. It was moving through the right hands, in the right order, with the right documentation. Whatever the outcome, the process was sound. That was what Princessen had come to ensure, in the end. Not any particular outcome, not that Camilla would or wouldn't get to wear the tiara, not that the guard would or wouldn't be commended, not that the communication failure would or wouldn't result in consequences for the people involved. What she had come to ensure was that the process held. That the institutional machinery worked the way it was supposed to work, even when the situation placed it under pressure that was unusual and deeply personal. The machinery had held. Inside the secured room on the second floor, the Vladimir tiara sat in its case. The pearl drops hung in their careful arrangement. The diamond arches caught the controlled light and sent it back in small, precise points, the way they had caught and returned light in grand European ballrooms more than 100 years before, at dinners and receptions and ceremonies that were themselves long gone, absorbed into history the way this week would eventually be absorbed, the immediate drama fading until only the outline of it remained. History had a way of doing that, reducing events to their outlines, keeping only what turned out to matter in the long run. The tiara would survive its story. The tiara always survived its stories. That was part of what made it what it was. The days moved forward. The authorization for the state dinner loan was still pending. The exhibition installation continued on schedule, with the Vladimir tiara as its planned centerpiece. Sergeant Hartley continued his shifts, and the corridor outside the secured room was quiet again, and the palace absorbed the week's small drama back into itself until the surfaces were smooth and the signs of friction invisible. But, underneath the surfaces, things had shifted, in the small, structural ways that institutional reforms always shifted things, not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. A protocol had been reviewed. A gap had been identified and was being closed. A guard had held his position and been held up, quietly, as an example of someone who understood what it meant to do a job properly, not just adequately. And, in 3 weeks' time, whether the Vladimir tiara made it to the state dinner or stayed in its case, the exhibition would open, and thousands of people would file past the display and look at the tiara and feel, each in their own way, whatever it was that people felt when they stood in front of something that had survived this long and accumulated this much, and was still somehow here. That was the part that no authorization form could capture. The part that existed outside protocol and procedure and institutional process. The part that was simply the thing itself, in the light, waiting. The exhibition opened on a Wednesday, and London cooperated with the kind of late autumn morning that the city occasionally produced as if to remind people why they stayed. Cold but clear, the sky a thin, precise blue, the streets still damp from overnight rain and, catching what light there was and, holding it briefly before letting it go. The queue outside the exhibition hall formed an hour before the doors opened, and, by the time the first visitors were admitted, it stretched back nearly 200 meters and contained the full spectrum of people who came to these things: art historians with lanyards and specific agendas, couples who had found the event while looking for something to do on a day off, school groups with clipboards, tourists who had not planned to be there but had seen the signs and followed them, retirees who came because they had memories of the late Queen and wanted to be close to something that had been close to her. The Vladimir Tiara was positioned at the center of the main gallery, in the custom case the curators had spent 3 months selecting and 1 month waiting for, under a lighting arrangement that had been adjusted and readjusted until the lead conservator declared it as close to perfect as any artificial light would ever get. The pearl drops caught it exactly as intended, holding the light for a moment before releasing it in a small, soft cascade that made the whole piece seem less like an object on display and more like something still in use, still in motion, still in the middle of its own long life. Visitors stopped in front of it. That was the measure of an exhibition, not the reviews, not the attendance numbers, though both of those would come and both would be good, but the quality of the stopping. Whether people actually ceased moving in front of the object, or whether they simply moved past it in the continuous shuffle of people who are processing information faster than they can feel it. In front of the Vladimir Tiara, people stopped. They stopped and they looked, and some of them read the panel beside the case, and some of them did not bother because looking was already enough, and some of them said things to the person they had come with, and some of them said nothing, and some of them took photographs that they would look at later and find somehow inadequate, because the thing the photographs captured was not the same thing they had been standing in front of when they took them. The catalog essay on the tiara, written by the lead curator, described its history in careful, well-researched prose and made specific mention of the challenges involved in preparing it for display, noting, without elaborating, that the piece had required exceptional coordination between multiple institutional parties to ensure its availability for the exhibition. It was a diplomatic sentence. It was also, in context, slightly funny to the small number of people who understood exactly what kind of coordination it was referring to. The question of the state dinner loan had been resolved the previous week, and the resolution had been a compromise that satisfied everyone and delighted no one, which is the particular signature of a genuine institutional compromise. The tiara would not be physically removed from the exhibition. The insurance liability, the conservation risk, and the logistical complexity of moving and returning it within a single evening were all assessed as greater than any of the relevant parties were comfortable assuming. Instead, Camilla's team and the Royal Collection Trust had worked together to identify a comparable piece from the Royal Collection's permanent holdings that would be appropriate for the state dinner, the Greville tiara, which Camilla had worn before and which carried its own significant history, its own considerable beauty, and its own considerable weight, both literal and symbolic. Camilla had agreed to this arrangement without visible objection. Whether she was entirely satisfied with it was a question that nobody in a position to ask had asked, and probably would not. What was visible, in the photographs taken at the state dinner, was that she wore the Greville tiara with the particular ease of someone who has made peace with a decision and chosen to inhabit it fully. She looked, as she always looked at these events, completely herself, composed, assured, present. The tiara caught the light at the top of the palace steps exactly as jewelry is supposed to catch light on such occasions, and the photographs were exactly what photographs of these occasions are supposed to be. There was no visible trace, in any of it, of the week that had preceded it. But the week was there, underneath. These things were always there, underneath the decisions and the friction and the moments where the right thing had to be insisted upon before it could happen. The visible surface of institutional life was built on a substrate of invisible maintenance, and that maintenance was performed by people who rarely appeared in photographs and were very seldom the subjects of stories. Sergeant David Hartley was not at the state dinner. His assignment was the exhibition, and the exhibition was his concern. He worked his shift, went home, and watched a documentary about deep-sea fish that he had been meaning to watch for several months. He was not a man who required his significance to be visible to other people to feel it himself. He understood, without needing anyone to tell him, that the moment in the corridor had mattered. He had done the right thing in a situation where doing the right thing required something of him, and that was enough. It was always enough, when it was real. There was, in the weeks after the incident, one moment of formal recognition, not public, not recorded, and not the sort of thing that would ever appear in any document accessible to the outside world, but real nonetheless. Princess N, in the course of a routine security debrief that was part of the exhibition's ongoing protocols, made a point of noting, in the specific and accurate language of someone who does not waste words, that the exhibition's security procedures had functioned exactly as designed, and that the personnel assigned to the secured area had demonstrated the kind of professional conduct that made institutions trustworthy. She named no names in the official record. She did not need to. Everyone present understood who she was talking about, and the people who mattered understood what she was saying. It was her way. She did not make gestures. She made points, precisely, in the appropriate context, and she trusted people to understand them. It had taken most of the people who worked alongside her the better part of a decade to fully understand this about her, that the absence of performance was not the absence of acknowledgement, that a well-placed sentence in the right room was worth more than a public statement, and that she reserved her formal regard for moments when it was genuinely earned. When it came, it landed differently than praise from people who offered it freely. The exhibition ran for 6 weeks. Attendance exceeded projections by nearly 30%, which the curatorial team attributed partly to the strength of the collection and partly to a renewed public interest in the late Queen's jewelry following a documentary series that had aired during the same period. The Vladimir tiara was consistently the most visited object in the show, not because it was the most historically significant piece on display, which it arguably was, but because it had the quality that only certain objects possessed, the quality of seeming to be present in a way that went beyond its physical existence, as though the accumulated weight of everything it had witnessed had given it a kind of gravity that visitors could feel without being able to explain. When the exhibition closed, the Vladimir tiara was carefully deinstalled by the conservation team, logged out of the exhibition inventory, re-evaluated for any changes in condition, there were none, and returned to the secure storage facility of the Royal Collection Trust, where it would remain until the next occasion called for it. The process was orderly and precise. Every step was documented. Every person who handled it signed their initials in the log. The whole thing took 3 hours and generated 7 pages of paperwork. The loan agreement was formally closed by both parties with signatures and the usual expressions of gratitude. The curatorial team sent a letter to the palace, and the palace sent a letter back, and both letters were archived in the appropriate files where they would sit, unread, for however many years it took before some future researcher came across them and found them useful for a purpose nobody currently alive would have thought to anticipate. That was how history was actually made, in most cases. Not in the dramatic moments, though those had their place, but in the paperwork. In the files. In the accumulated documentation of decisions and conversations and processes that had seemed, at the time, entirely unremarkable, and which turned out to matter because they had happened, because they had been recorded, because the record had survived. The Vladimir tiara's own history was a version of this, not a single dramatic story but a long accumulation of smaller ones, each contributing something to what the piece was by the time it arrived in any given place. Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, who had commissioned it, had no way of knowing that it would leave Russia after her death and spend a century in England. Queen Mary, who had purchased it, could not have imagined all the occasions on which her granddaughter would choose to wear it, or which of those occasions would end up being remembered and which would be forgotten. Queen Elizabeth herself, who had worn it more than anyone, had worn it first as a young woman and last as an old one, and all the years between were visible, somehow, in the accumulated meaning of the piece, not inscribed there, not documented, but present in the way that presence accumulated in objects that had been handled with genuine care over a long time. Camilla's connection to it, such as it was, would become part of that accumulation too. Not the corridor incident, which had been too small and too private to register in any historical record. But, the visit, the half-hour conversation with the curator about Russian metalworking and pearl conservation that had been logged, as all curatorial visits were logged, and the log noted that the queen consort had asked unusually specific and knowledgeable questions about the piece, and that the conversation had been notably substantive. Future researchers who came across that log entry would have no context for it, no way of knowing what had preceded it or what the conversation had cost in institutional friction before it could happen. They would simply see that someone who mattered had taken the time to understand what they were looking at, and had asked the right questions, and had listened to the answers. That was not nothing. In the long run, that was often what lasted, not the confrontations or the dramas or the moments of institutional pressure, but the quality of attention paid to things that deserved attention, and the record of that attention surviving to tell future people that the past had understood what it held. The British royal family held an extraordinary amount. Not just in terms of objects, though the royal collection, which ran to over 1 million items, was an almost incomprehensible accumulation of material history, but in terms of the institutional knowledge that surrounded those objects, the protocols that protected them, the people whose daily work kept them safe and available and properly documented. All of it required maintenance. All of it required people who understood that the rules existed for reasons, and who were willing to enforce those reasons even when enforcing them was uncomfortable. Sergeant David Hartley continued his work. He was assigned to other details after the exhibition closed, different buildings and different objects and different configurations of the same essential task, which was to stand between valuable things and the world and ensure that only the right people, with the right authorization, at the right time, got through. He was good at this work. He had always been good at it. The corridor incident did not change who he was, it revealed who he was, which was a different thing and more permanent. Princess Anne continued her own work with the same focused efficiency that had characterized it for 5 decades. She chaired her committees, attended her engagements, reviewed her protocols, and said very little in public about any of it, because she understood, at a level that was almost philosophical, that the value of work was in the doing and not in the telling. She had said what needed to be said in the debrief. The matter was closed. Camilla wore the Greville tiara at the state dinner and was photographed in it and smiled at the right moments and spoke with the right people and performed all the functions of her role with the professional precision that years of preparation had made second nature. She was, by every external measure, entirely fine. She was, by many accounts, entirely herself. Whatever the corridor had cost her in terms of the particular small frustration of being told no by someone substantially her junior in every conventional hierarchy, she had absorbed it, because absorbing things was what the life required, and because the life had trained her thoroughly in the art of it. The Greville tiara was beautiful. It was, in its own right, a remarkable piece of jewelry with its own remarkable history, and it caught the light at the top of the palace steps exactly as it was supposed to catch the light, and the photographs were very good. The Vladimir tiara, back in storage, was in perfect condition. All of it, in the end, had worked out the way things were supposed to work out when the rules held and the people responsible for enforcing them did their jobs. That was not a dramatic conclusion. It was not the kind of ending that made anyone's pulse quicken. It was the kind of ending that institutions aimed for every time: quiet, orderly, complete, with the important things intact and the process proven sound, and the record showing, for anyone who bothered to read it, that when it mattered, the right people had done the right thing, and the right things had stayed safe. The Vladimir tiara waited in its case, in the dark, in the silence of a properly controlled storage environment where temperature and humidity were maintained at levels calculated to keep it exactly as it was, not forever, because nothing lasted forever, but for as long as careful, consistent, respectful attention could manage. Which was a very long time. Which had already been a very long time. Which would, with the same quality of attention and the same institutional seriousness that had protected it so far, continue to be a very long time. That was the real story. Not the corridor, not the confrontation, not the names and titles and momentary friction of the lives that briefly intersected around this object. The real story was the object itself, and the long human effort to keep it safe, and the fact that on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, when that effort was tested in a small way, it had held. It had held. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly everything.